The sun hung lazily in the sky, spilling golden rays over the busy marketplace. Stalls stretched out in every direction, bursting with color, red tomatoes piled high, bunches of plantains swaying in the breeze, and large round watermelons resting in wooden crates. The air smelled of ripe mangoes, frying akara, and the sweat of traders who had been haggling since dawn. Among the vendors, a sudden commotion erupted. "Ah, madman! Madman! Go away!" A woman selling yams shouted, grabbing a broom and swinging it toward a man with unkempt hair and ragged clothes. The man staggered back, his bare feet scraping against the dusty ground. He was tall, lean, with a beard thick and wild like a nest of tangled roots. His clothes, once white, were now stained with dust and torn at the edges. His eyes, though weary and lost, held a strange softness beneath the madness. "Leave this place, oh," another vendor yelled, waving a wooden spoon in his direction. "See as he dey smell like rotten fish." One of the meat sellers sneered, his face twisting in disgust. The madman did not protest. He simply turned his gaze toward a pile of oranges at a nearby stall, his lips parting slightly as if he were about to speak. But no words came out. Instead, his stomach growled loudly. "Come out for here. This place no be for people like you," the orange seller scolded, pulling his tray closer as if the madman would suddenly snatch something. Children playing nearby noticed the scene, and like little wolves drawn to weakness, they pounced. "See, madman," one of them shrieked, clapping his hands. They danced around him, their small feet kicking up dust as they chanted, "Tinko, tinko, madman de waka, him no get shoe, him no get cloth, him head be like coconut." The madman flinched as a pebble struck his arm. He winced but did not react. More laughter erupted from the children, their voices carrying through the market like a cruel melody. Then, suddenly, "Hey! Stop that!" A firm but warm voice rang through the air, cutting through the taunts like a knife. The children froze. A young woman stood with her hands on her wide hips, her round face flushed with anger. Her skin was smooth, glowing in the sunlight, her cheeks full and dimpled. She had thick black curls tied into a loose bun, and her wrapper, a deep purple, was tied securely over her full waist. She was not just beautiful. She had a presence that demanded attention. "Go home and help your mothers instead of tormenting people," she scolded, narrowing her eyes at the children. One of the boys, no older than 10, hesitated before mumbling, "But he be madman." "And so what?" she shot back. "Is he disturbing you?" The children exchanged nervous glances, then, mumbling among themselves, they scampered away, their mischief momentarily forgotten. The market quieted slightly, the vendors watching curiously. The young woman turned to the madman, who was now staring at her with quiet surprise. Without a word, she reached into the woven basket by her side and pulled out a small plastic bag filled with fresh fruits. Bananas, slices of watermelon, and an orange. "Here," she said gently, pressing it into his rough, trembling hands. The madman blinked. His fingers, scarred and dirty, clutched the bag as if afraid it would disappear. "You should eat," she said with a small smile, before turning on her heel and walking back to her stall. The madman watched her go. For the first time in a long while, someone had looked at him, not with fear, not with disgust, but with kindness. As the market returned to its usual noise and chatter, he stood there, clutching the bag of fruit, his heart pounding in a way it hadn't in years. The sun had barely risen, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and orange, when Rahina stepped out of her family compound, a small woven basket swinging from her arm. The morning air was cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and the distant aroma of freshly baked bread from the roadside bakers. She adjusted the wrapper tied securely over her wide hips and began her daily walk to the market. As she passed the quiet streets, she spotted a familiar figure near an abandoned kiosk. A man curled up against the wooden structure, his head resting on his arm. His clothes were still ragged, his beard still thick and unkempt, but something about him seemed different today. She slowed her steps. The madman. His eyes were half closed, as if he had spent the night fighting sleep, and his feet, cracked and dusty, stuck out awkwardly from beneath his torn kaftan. Rahina sighed, reaching into her basket. She pulled out a small banana and an orange, then knelt beside him. "Here," she said, her voice soft. His eyes flickered open. For a moment, he just stared at her. Then, with slow, uncertain movements, he reached out and took the fruits. Rahina smiled. "Eat well." She stood up and continued on her way. That night, as she lay on her thin mattress, staring at the wooden ceiling, she felt a familiar emptiness creep in. Her life was simple, too simple. Every morning, she went to the market, sold her fruits, haggled with stubborn customers, and then returned home to eat, sleep, and do it all over again. She had no husband, no lover, not even a suitor knocking at her door. At 25, she had watched girls much younger than her get married and start families, while she remained alone. People whispered, "Why hasn't Rahina married?" With her looks, she should have at least one child by now. Maybe she's too proud, waiting for a rich man. But Rahina wasn't waiting for riches or status. She simply believed love would come when it was meant to. "When he comes my way, there will be a wedding," she always told herself. And with that thought, she closed her eyes and fell asleep. The next morning, Rahina walked to the market with her best friend Amina, who carried a basket of dried fish on her hip. The two women walked side by side, chatting about the latest gossip from their neighborhood. "Did you hear?" Amina said excitedly. "Hawa's husband bought her a sewing machine. Now she will be making clothes for the whole village." "Good for her," Rahina replied with a small smile. "Ah, Rahina, when will we talk about your own husband?" Amina teased, nudging her playfully. Rahina only laughed. "You know my answer, Amina. When he comes my way, there will be a wedding." Amina rolled her eyes. "You and this your patience. If you wait too long, we will all become grandmothers before you even wear a wedding dress." Rahina was about to reply when she suddenly stopped walking. Under a neem tree by the roadside, she spotted him, the madman. He sat with his back against the rough bark, his knees drawn to his chest, his head tilted downward. His fingers traced patterns in the dirt, absent-mindedly. Without a word, Rahina reached into her basket, pulled out a mango, and excused herself. Amina frowned. "Rahina, where are you going?" Rahina walked over to the tree and gently placed the fruit beside him. The madman looked up, his eyes meeting hers. For a brief second, there was something deep and unreadable in his gaze, something that almost made her heart skip a beat. She smiled, "Eat." Then, just as quickly as she came, she turned back toward Amina. Amina's mouth was slightly open in shock. "Rahina, what was that? What was what?" You gave him food." "A madman," Rahina shrugged. "So?" Amina grabbed her arm. "So? You, a well-respected fruit seller, are feeding a madman in public? People will talk." Rahina laughed. "Let them talk. It is only kindness, Amina. He has done nothing to me." Amina sighed, shaking her head. "Rahina, you are too soft-hearted. One day, kindness might put you in trouble. Or maybe," Rahina said, her voice thoughtful, "kindness will bring me something beautiful." Amina scoffed. "Only you will say something like that." The two friends continued toward the market, their chatter filling the morning air. But as Rahina walked, she found herself glancing back at the madman, and for the first time she wondered about him. Who was he before he lost himself? And why did he look at her that way? The market was buzzing with its usual noise, women shouting prices over each other, the rhythmic pounding of pestles in mortar, the sizzle of frying akara, and the chatter of early morning customers. The air smelled of roasted fish, groundnut oil, and ripened fruits, mixing into the familiar scent of Rahina's daily life. She was adjusting a basket of pineapples on her stall when suddenly, "Thief! Thief!" "Oh!" A loud, shrill cry shot through the marketplace, freezing people in their tracks. Rahina turned sharply toward the commotion. The plantain seller, a plump woman with a wrapper tied loosely around her waist, was standing near her stall, her arms flailing as she pointed at a hunched figure near the edge of the market. "It is that madman!" she shouted. "He took 2 of my roasted plantains and ate them like an animal." Gasps erupted from the crowd. Vendors and customers alike turned to stare at the madman, who stood frozen, his hands still clenching the last bite of plantain. His beard was wet with rain from the morning drizzle, his clothes clung to his thin frame, and his eyes, wide, nervous, darted from one face to another. The plantain seller kept shouting, "He is a thief! If we leave him like this, tomorrow he will steal more." A few men nearby stepped forward, their faces dark with anger. Rahina's heart clenched. She didn't think, she just moved. Before anyone could act, she pushed through the small crowd, reached into her waist pouch, and pulled out some money. "I will pay for him," she said firmly, her voice clear and steady. The plantain seller turned to her, eyebrows raised. "Rahina, you will pay for a madman?" "He is just hungry," Rahina said, pressing the money into the woman's hand. "Not a thief. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some shook their heads, others whispered to each other. But the plantain seller, seeing the money in her palm, huffed and pocketed it. She muttered. You are lucky this one saved you. With that, the market's attention shifted. People went back to their trading, their chatter returning to the usual gossip. Rahina turned back to the madman. He was still staring at her, his dark eyes filled with something unreadable. She gave him a small smile before walking back to her stall, but she could still feel his gaze lingering on her. That night, the rain poured heavily. It drummed against the tin roof of Rahina's house, the wind howling like an angry spirit. She sat on her wooden bed, wrapping her shawl tighter around her shoulders as she reached to close the window. Then she saw it, a shadowy figure barely visible through the thick downpour. Her heart skipped. She squinted, rubbing the glass pane with her palm. The figure moved, a shivering, hunched form, standing near the side of her house, soaked to the bone. Her breath caught in her throat. It was him. Rahina hesitated only for a second before grabbing her shawl and hurrying outside. The rain hit her like cold needles, drenching her instantly, but she pushed forward. Come, she said, grabbing his arm. He flinched, his body stiff and trembling, but he didn't resist as she led him toward the small shed at the back of her house. The shed was small, just a simple wooden structure where she stored extra baskets and mats. She pulled a dry mat to the corner and gestured for him to sit. He did, slowly, his body curling in on itself like a wounded animal. Wait here, she said. She rushed back inside, returning moments later with a small bowl of rice and a cup of water. She placed them in front of him. Eat. For a moment, he just stared at the food. Then, cautiously, he reached out, picking up the spoon. He ate slowly at first, as if afraid it might disappear, but soon his hunger took over. He shoveled the rice into his mouth, his throat bobbing as he swallowed greedily. Rahina watched him silently, her heart aching. Do you have a name? She asked softly. The spoon in his hand paused. For the longest time, he didn't speak. Then, in a voice so hoarse and broken, she almost missed it, he whispered, Daniel. Rahina's breath hitched. It was the first time she had heard his voice, and in that moment, something inside her shifted. By morning, Daniel was gone. The moment Rahina stepped into the shed, she found the mat empty, the cup of water tipped over. The only proof that he had been there was the small indentation on the mat where he had slept. She wasn't sure why she felt disappointed. Brushing off the strange feeling, she focused on the day ahead. The market would be busy. There were fruits to arrange, customers to haggle with, and money to make. She pushed Daniel's disappearance to the back of her mind and got ready for the day. The sun was high when Rahina returned from the market, exhaustion weighing on her shoulders. She had barely placed down her basket when a loud knock startled her. Bang! 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 Her heart clenched. She already knew who it was. Dragging her feet, she walked to the door and opened it. There he stood, her landlord, Malam Musa, a thin, beady-eyed man with a face that always seemed set in disapproval. He leaned on his wooden cane, his lips pressing into a firm line. Rahina, he started, his tone already heavy with impatience. It is time. Rahina swallowed hard. Malam Musa, please, you are owing me 2 months' rent, he interrupted, tapping his cane on the ground. How long do you think I will wait? I know, sir, she said quickly. I have part of it. Please take this. She reached into the pouch tied around her waist and handed him a bundle of crumpled Naira notes. Malam Musa counted them slowly, his lips moving with each number. This is not enough, he said, his expression hardening. Rahina's eyes stung. I swear I will get the rest in 2 weeks. Malam Musa sighed, his cane shifting as he thought. 2 weeks, Rahina. That is all. Thank you, sir. Without another word, he turned and walked away, his sandals scraping against the dusty ground. Rahina shut the door and leaned against it, tears pooling in her eyes. Where will I get the rest of the money? She wiped at her face angrily and stepped outside. The sky was beginning to dim, a warm orange glow stretching across the horizon. She sat on the small stool outside her house, staring at nothing in particular, mumbling to herself. This life is unfair, she muttered, her hands clenched into fists on her lap. I work hard every day, yet I am always struggling. What did I do to deserve this? Her voice cracked. Maybe I should just pack my things and go back to my village. At least I won't have to worry about rent there. She buried her face in her hands. She was so lost in her frustration that she didn't notice him. Daniel. He was standing a short distance away, near the shade of a broken fence. He didn't come closer, didn't make a sound, but he was listening. His dark, unreadable eyes were fixed on her, his expression blank as always. He didn't understand everything she was saying, but he felt the sadness in her voice, the heaviness in her words. For the first time, he saw Rahina not as the woman who gave him food, not as the kind market vendor, but as someone who carried burdens of her own. The wind blew softly. She sniffed, wiping at her face, and sighed deeply. Then, without a word, Daniel turned and disappeared into the evening shadows. 2 days passed. Rahina had barely recovered from the weight of her rent troubles when another knock echoed against her wooden door. Bang! 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 Her stomach twisted. Her rent was due in 2 weeks. But what if Malam Musa had changed his mind? What if he was here to demand the rest of the money now? Taking a deep breath, she opened the door. Malam Musa stood there, but his usual sour expression was gone. Instead, he had a wide smile plastered across his face. Rahina blinked in confusion. Malam Musa? Rahina. His voice was light, almost cheerful. You will not believe what has happened. She hesitated. What? You no longer have to pay rent. Her heart skipped. What? Malam Musa beamed. Someone has bought the house in your name. You are now the owner. Rahina felt the world tilt. What are you saying? I am saying this house belongs to you now. He clapped his hands together. No more rent. No more landlords. Rahina's mouth opened, but no words came out. Who? She finally asked. Who bought it? Malam Musa shrugged. I don't know. The payment was made in full, and the papers are in your name. Her legs felt weak. This had to be a mistake, a miracle, a joke. But why? She whispered. Malam Musa chuckled. Maybe Allah has smiled on you. Congratulations, Rahina. With that, he turned and walked away, whistling a happy tune. Rahina stood frozen at her doorstep, her heart racing. Who could have done this? For now, she had no answer. But she knew one thing. She had a home of her own. The rest of the day passed in a blur. She went to the market as usual, but she couldn't shake off the news. Every time she thought about it, her mind spun. She had spent years struggling to pay rent, and now, just like that, it was gone. As she walked through the marketplace, her thoughts swirling, her eyes landed on someone familiar. Daniel. He was sitting under his usual tree, staring off into the distance. His hair was wild as always, his clothes torn and filthy. For some reason, she found herself looking at his face. Then her eyes traveled downward, and that's when she saw it. His manhood, out, exposed. Rahina's breath caught in her throat. Heat rushed to her face. Her body went stiff, and then, like a lightning bolt, she turned and bolted. Her feet pounded against the dusty ground, her heart hammering in embarrassment. She didn't stop running until she reached the second-hand clothing stall. Panting, she grabbed the nearest shirt and trousers she could find and slapped some money into the seller's hands. I need these, she gasped. The seller, an older woman, raised an eyebrow, but took the money. Rahina snatched the clothes and rushed away, her face still burning. She didn't know why she was doing this. Maybe it was out of kindness, or maybe it was just to stop herself from ever seeing that again. Rahina wasn't sure why her hands trembled as she clutched the small plastic bag. Inside were the second-hand clothes she had bought, the ones she had practically fled the market to get. And some food, of course. She took slow steps toward the tree where Daniel always sat. He was there, his wild hair unkempt, his clothes still in tatters. Her face heated just thinking about what she had seen the day before. Yallah! Clearing her throat, she carefully placed the bag beside him. Here, she muttered, her voice almost a whisper. Daniel blinked at her, his dark, unreadable eyes locking onto hers. She felt her cheeks burn even more. These are for you, she continued, avoiding his gaze. Clothes and food. Daniel remained still, staring at her like she had spoken an unfamiliar language. Rahina swallowed hard. Wear them, okay? And before he could move or respond, she turned on her heels and walked away. Fast. She didn't look back. Her heart pounded in her chest as she reached her fruit stall, forcing herself to focus on peeling oranges instead of the strange warmth curling in her stomach. As the days passed, Rahina's kindness toward Daniel didn't stop. She found herself setting aside little portions of fruits for him before the market rush, dropping them quietly by his side. She even noticed that he wore the new clothes she had given him, though they were still a little unkempt. It wasn't just Rahina who began seeing him differently. Other villagers, once quick to shoo him away, began softening. The woman who sold roasted groundnuts started leaving tiny portions where he sat. The man who sold pure water no longer chased him away when he hovered too close to his stall. The madman, once treated like a ghost, was now acknowledged, even if it was just in small ways. While Rahina was busy in the market, unaware of the slow ripples her kindness had created, an entirely different conversation was taking place in the palace. The king sat on his grand wooden throne, watching as the palace attendants moved swiftly, decorating the hall with fresh flowers and golden fabrics. A visitor was coming. Not just any visitor. The most eligible bachelor in the entire region. A billionaire. He had left their hometown as a child, raised in wealth and power overseas. Now he was returning, by his late mother's wish, to find a wife. The king wanted everything to be perfect. His chief stood before him, discussing arrangements. The town must be spotless, one said. We must present our most beautiful maidens, another added. The king stroked his beard. Let us make sure he feels at home. Outside the palace, whispers spread. A billionaire was coming to find a wife, and every unmarried woman in the village held her breath. Rahina sat under her fruit stall, peeling oranges with slow, careful movements. The market buzzed with excitement, but she barely paid attention. The news had spread like wildfire. A billionaire was coming to town. And not just any billionaire, one returning to his roots in search of a wife. Everywhere she turned, women whispered about it, eyes shining with hope. They say he is more handsome than a prince. I heard his cars alone can buy the whole market. He will surely choose the fairest maiden in the land. Rahina listened but did not engage. Why would she? No man had ever looked at her with longing before. She had lived 25 years in this village, and never, not once, had a man approached her with words of affection. Not for love, not for marriage. She was beautiful. She knew that much. Her skin was smooth, her eyes bright, and she carried herself with confidence. But her body, her size. Men in the village wanted slim, graceful women. The ones who could dance lightly, sway their hips with elegance, not a chubby fruit seller with strong arms and a wide waist. So she didn't bother preparing for his arrival. While the other women spent days picking out their best outfits, buying new perfumes, and fixing their hair, she continued her daily routine. Selling fruits, feeding Daniel, sleeping. It was enough. The morning of his arrival was a sight to behold. The village had transformed overnight. Bright-colored fabrics hung from rooftops, golden decorations lined the palace gates, and the streets smelled of freshly cooked food. All the shops, including Rahina's, were closed for the occasion. Everyone gathered at the palace compound. She stood at the back, near the fruit trees, watching silently as the crowd buzzed with anticipation. The women were at the front, draped in their finest clothes. Red, blue, gold, green, colors bursting like a garden in bloom. Their hair was adorned with beads, their skin glowing with oil. They stood tall, their faces filled with excitement. Rahina did not join them. She had dressed as she always did, in a simple wrapper and blouse, nothing fancy. She wasn't meant for men like him. She knew that. And yet, as the sound of roaring engines filled the air and the billionaire's convoy approached, her heart betrayed her. It ached, not for him, but for the love she had never known. The air was thick with anticipation. Every eye in the village was glued to the long line of sleek black cars rolling into the palace compound. The ground trembled slightly under the weight of their presence, the sunlight bouncing off their polished surfaces. The first car came to a stop, and the door opened. A tall, well-dressed man stepped out. Nura. He was striking, his dark skin smooth, his jaw sharp, his shoulders broad under the crisp white kaftan he wore. His black leather shoes gleamed, and a gold wristwatch peeked from under his sleeve. The crowd inhaled as one, a collective breath of admiration. The women at the front pushed forward slightly, their eyes shining, and leading them all was Zara. Zara had always been the village's reigning queen of beauty. Tall and slender, she carried herself like royalty, always draped in the finest fabrics, always aware of the power her looks held over men, and she had already made up her mind. Nura would be hers. As he greeted the king with a respectful bow, she smiled confidently, her eyes locked on him like a hunter spotting prey. During Nura's stay, the entire village buzzed with excitement. The king hosted feasts in his honor, and the maidens of the village went out of their way to capture his attention. But Zara was different. She didn't just try to impress him, she set a trap. With charm and subtle manipulation, she managed to get close to him. Her laughter was the loudest at gatherings, her presence impossible to ignore, and then one fateful night, she made her move. She invited him to a private feast in her father's compound, where she served him food laced with a carefully measured dose of sleeping herbs. By the time Nura felt the heaviness in his limbs, it was too late. His vision blurred. His body relaxed, and soon he was out cold. Zara wasted no time. Slipping into bed beside him, she smiled to herself. By morning, the village would believe she had spent the night in his arms, and soon, very soon, she would announce her pregnancy. Chapter 9. The Prince's Choice. The day had finally come. The day when Nura, the supposed billionaire, would choose his wife. It was a grand event, one that no one could afford to miss. The king had made it clear, every unmarried woman in the village must attend. Even Rahina. She had no choice but to go. She tried not to think too much about it as she wore a simple yet neat attire, tying her scarf with little effort. Unlike the other girls who spent hours adorning themselves, she only took a deep breath and stepped out. She was only attending because she had to. After all, why would a man like Nura even glance at a woman like her? The grand gathering. The palace was breathtaking. Decorated with flowers and golden fabrics, it gleamed under the afternoon sun. The entire village gathered, filling the grand courtyard. At the front stood Nura, dressed in another perfectly tailored kaftan, his presence commanding. Beside him, the king sat on his high throne, watching with a knowing gaze. The women stood in rows, their bright-colored clothes swaying in the breeze, their faces painted with hope and anticipation. And in the middle of them all was Zara. She stood taller than the rest, her chin slightly raised, her confidence unshaken. Today would be the day she sealed her future. She had done everything right. She had spent the night with him. She was the most beautiful. There was no competition, or so she thought. The crowd quieted as Nura stepped forward. His voice was deep, steady. "Before I choose my bride, there is someone you all must meet." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. 2 guards appeared at the far end of the courtyard, and between them, the madman. The entire village gasped. Some stepped back, others exchanged looks of confusion and horror. Rahina froze. Zara let out a sound of disgust. What was he doing here? The man who had spent years wandering the village, feeding on scraps, sleeping in dirt, the man Rahina had always protected. What was going on? Then Nura spoke again. "This," he said, turning to the madman, "is the real Nura." The air grew still. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. "What?" someone whispered. "What is he saying?" Rahina's heart pounded in her chest. Nura, the man they had all thought was the billionaire, gave a small knowing smile. "I am not Nura," he continued. "I am merely his driver, and this man you see before you is the real billionaire." Silence, then shock, confusion, disbelief. The entire village stood frozen as the guards led the madman away. Minutes later, he returned, but he was no longer the man they knew. Gone were the tattered rags, gone was the dirt-streaked skin. In his place stood a man so breathtakingly handsome that even the most beautiful women in the village averted their eyes in shame. His dark skin glowed under the light, his tall, broad frame draped in a fine embroidered robe. His once wild hair was now neatly cut, his beard trimmed to perfection, and his eyes, deep, piercing, scanned the crowd with quiet authority. The village had never seen such a transformation. People whispered in shock. Zara felt her knees weaken. Rahina, speechless, could only stare. The real Nura stepped forward, his voice firm. "I lived among you for months," he said, "as nothing more than a madman, and in that time I saw the hearts of men." His gaze swept over the crowd, lingering on those who had once mocked and shunned him. "I saw cruelty, I saw greed, I saw arrogance." Then his eyes landed on Rahina, and I saw kindness. Her breath caught. The woman who gave me food when I was starving. The woman who sheltered me when I had nowhere to go. The woman who, despite her own struggles, never turned away from someone in need. A slow, warm smile touched his lips. "And today I choose her as my wife." Gasps echoed. All heads turned to Rahina. She felt the world spin beneath her feet. Zara's mouth fell open, her face pale with rage and disbelief. Rahina's lips parted, but no words came. Was this real? The real Nura, the true billionaire, had chosen her? Not Zara. Not any of the other women. Her? Nura walked toward her, stopping just a breath away. He looked at her the way no man ever had, like she was the most precious thing he had ever seen, like she was enough, like she was his choice. "Rahina," he said softly, "will you marry me?" Tears burned in her eyes, her lips trembled, and in that moment, for the first time in her life, she felt truly, deeply seen. The day had finally come.